The day I came home and found an 80-year-old oak tree missing from my front yard was the day I stopped believing that common sense always wins. You'd think somebody cutting down a tree that size would involve paperwork, phone calls, maybe even a conversation. Apparently not. Apparently all it took was a few people wearing safety vests, a couple chainsaws, and an HOA board that had spent years convincing itself it owned things it didn't. My name is Ethan Caldwell, and a few years ago, I lived in a quiet neighborhood outside Franklin Ridge, the kind of place where people wave from their driveways, kids rode bikes until dark, and everybody complained about the HOA, but nobody ever challenged it. At least not until they came after something that mattered to me. The oak tree stood in the corner of my front yard long before my house existed. According to an old survey I found after moving in, the tree was already mature when the first roads were cut through the area. It wasn't just a tree. It was the landmark people used when giving directions. Delivery drivers knew it. Kids waited for school buses under it. Every spring it filled with birds, and every summer half the block parked under its shade when the afternoon sun got brutal. I love that tree. My late father loved that tree too. The first thing he said when he visited after I bought the house was, "Don't ever let anybody touch that oak." At the time I laughed. Looking back, I wish I'd taken that warning more seriously. The tension with the HOA started about 2 years before everything exploded. It began with little comments during meetings. Someone would mention leaves falling on his sidewalks. Somebody else would complain that the branches blocked decorative lighting. Then there was Diane Mercer, the HOA president. Diane was one of those people who treated neighborhood rules like sacred scripture. She wasn't loud. She wasn't rude. In some ways that made her worse. She always spoke with that calm smile that made it sound like she was helping you while she quietly took something away. One evening, she approached me after a meeting and pointed toward the oak. "It's beautiful," she said, "but don't you think it's becoming a little too large for the neighborhood?" I remember laughing. The neighborhood grew around the tree, not the other way around. Her smile tightened for half a second before returning. "Well, some residents have concerns. Good thing it isn't their tree," I replied. She didn't like that answer. After that, the complaints became more frequent. Letters appeared in my mailbox. Landscaping suggestions, recommendations, friendly notices. Every one of them stopped just short of an actual violation because they knew they didn't have legal grounds. The tree was healthy. The city arborist had inspected it. There was no safety issue. Eventually, I figured they'd gotten bored and moved on. Turns out they were just waiting. The morning everything happened felt completely normal. I left for work around 7:30. I remember glancing at the tree as I backed out of the driveway. The sunlight was hitting the upper branches, birds were making noise, and for absolutely no reason at all, I found myself thinking how lucky I was to live there. 8 hours later, I pulled back into the neighborhood and immediately felt something was wrong. At first, I couldn't identify it. Then I noticed sunlight hitting my living room windows from an angle I'd never seen before. The street looked wider, brighter, empty. My stomach dropped before my brain caught up. I slammed the truck into park and got out. The tree was gone. Not trimmed. Not damaged. Gone. There was a massive stump where it had stood that morning, surrounded by piles of fresh wood chips. The smell of cut oak still hung in the air. For a few seconds, I just stood there staring because my mind refused to accept what my eyes were seeing. Then anger hit all at once. I ran inside and pulled up my doorbell camera footage. What I saw nearly made me throw the monitor across the room. At 9:12 that morning, 2 trucks pulled up. At 9:19, a crew started unloading chainsaws. By 9:26, they were cutting branches. Nobody knocked on my door. Nobody called. Nobody left a notice. By lunchtime, 80 years of history had been reduced to logs stacked in the back of a trailer. The footage showed one more thing that made my blood boil. Standing near the trucks, supervising the entire operation, was Diane Mercer, coffee cup in hand, watching like she was inspecting a landscaping project. I called the HOA office immediately. The receptionist transferred me twice before Diane picked up. "Ethan," she said casually, "how can I help you?" I actually laughed because I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "You cut down my tree." Silence. Then, the board determined it violated community landscaping standards. "You cut down my tree. It was creating visibility concerns." You cut down my property. Another pause. The board acted in the community's best interest. I remember gripping the phone so hard my hand hurt. Tell me something, Diane. Did anybody ever stop to check whether the community actually owned the land? For the first time, she sounded uncertain. Not worried, just uncertain. Like that possibility had never crossed her mind. The call ended a few minutes later with promises to review documentation and discuss the matter internally. That's corporate language for we're stalling. Most people probably would have called a lawyer right then. Honestly, I almost did. But later that night, after the anger settled down enough for me to think clearly, I spread property records across my dining room table and started digging through every document I had. And somewhere around midnight, while tracing old easement maps under a desk lamp, I found something that made me stop cold. Because hidden in a survey that nobody had looked at for years was a detail that would eventually turn this entire situation upside down. And before long, the people who thought they could do whatever they wanted on someone else's property were about to discover what happens when the rules finally point back at them. I sat there in my dining room table long after midnight, staring at that old survey map while the house stayed completely silent around me. The anger was still there, but it had changed shape. Earlier that evening, I wanted revenge. Now I wanted answers. There's a difference. Revenge is emotional. Answers are dangerous. The document in front of me wasn't even related to the oak tree. It was part of a utility survey filed almost 20 years before I bought the property. Most people would have ignored it. Honestly, I probably would have too if I hadn't been looking for every possible detail connected to my lot lines. Near the southeast corner of my property was a notation describing an electrical easement granted to the local power company. At first it seemed unimportant. Then I noticed something interesting. According to the map, a transformer and primary junction box sat partially within the easement corridor that crossed the edge of my land. I knew exactly where that equipment was because I passed it almost every day. What I hadn't realized was how much the HOA had built around it over the years. Decorative fencing, shrubs, stone landscaping, a flower bed, even a small decorative sign welcoming people into the community. The more I compared old records to current satellite images, the more uncomfortable the picture became. The HOA had slowly turned a utility access zone into a decorative neighborhood entrance. Maybe nobody had noticed. Maybe nobody cared. But utility companies care about one thing above all else: access. The next morning, I took a drive before work. I parked across the street and studied the area for nearly 20 minutes. Once I looked at it through the eyes of an inspector, it became obvious. The transformer was partially hidden behind landscaping. The access route wasn't clear. If emergency repairs were needed, crews would waste time removing obstacles before reaching critical equipment. Suddenly, I understood why the easement existed in the first place. By lunchtime, I had made a phone call. Not to a lawyer, not to the city, to the power company. I wasn't dramatic about it. I didn't make accusations. I simply explained that I had concerns regarding possible obstructions within an existing utility easement and wondered if someone should take a look. The representative thanked me and said an inspector would review the matter. That was it. 5 minutes. No threats. No demands. Just information. Then I waited. 3 days later, I was drinking coffee on my porch when a white utility truck pulled into the neighborhood. Then another one arrived. By the afternoon, there were 3. Men in reflective vests walked around taking photographs and measurements. I watched from a distance without saying a word. The HOA board, meanwhile, seemed completely unaware of what was happening. 2 days later, they became very aware. I was mowing my lawn when I noticed Diane walking quickly toward one of the inspectors. Her usual confidence was gone. She looked irritated, concerned, maybe even nervous. They spoke for several minutes. I couldn't hear the conversation, but I saw enough body language to understand the direction it was heading. The inspector pointed repeatedly toward the fencing, then the landscaping, then the transformer. Diane crossed her arms. The inspector handed her paperwork. She stopped arguing almost immediately. That evening, I received my first phone call from the HOA since the tree incident. Diane's voice sounded very different. "Ethan, have you contacted the utility company?" I leaned back in my chair and smiled. I reported a possible easement issue. "You know, this is causing unnecessary complications." I almost laughed. Unnecessary complications? That's an interesting phrase coming from someone who cut down an 80-year-old tree while I was at work. Silence. Then she said something I'll never forget. The situations aren't comparable. You're right, I replied. Mine involved property you didn't own. Yours involves property you don't own. She hung up. A week later, the official notice arrived. The utility company had completed its review and determined that portions of the HOA landscaping violated access requirements. The corrective action order wasn't optional. The fences had to come down. Decorative shrubs had to be removed. Stone borders had to be dismantled. Access routes had to remain permanently clear. Suddenly, the beautiful entrance area the HOA loved showing off became a construction zone. What happened next was almost surreal. Crews arrived with equipment and began tearing everything apart. Residents slowed their cars to watch. Neighbors stood outside talking. Questions spread through the community faster than gossip usually does. Why was the landscaping being removed? Why were utility workers everywhere? Why was the HOA spending money fixing something nobody knew was broken? That's when the story started leaking out. A few neighbors already knew about the oak tree because they had seen the trucks. Others had heard rumors. Once people connected the dots, the mood shifted dramatically. One evening, my next-door neighbor, Carl, walked over carrying a six-pack and sat beside me on the porch. He looked toward the construction area, and I shook his head. I heard Diane cut your tree down. The board did, I said. She just supervised. Carl laughed. And now the utility company is dismantling their fancy entrance. Looks that way. He took a sip of beer and grinned. That's the most satisfying thing I've heard all year. The funny thing is, I wasn't celebrating. Not really. People assume revenge feels amazing. Sometimes it does. But mostly I felt disappointed. I kept looking at the empty space where the oak had stood. Nothing happening across the street changed that. The tree was still gone. My father was still gone. The memories tied to that giant canopy of branches couldn't be rebuilt with a work order. Still, watching consequences finally arrive brought a certain sense of balance. For years, the HOA had operated under the assumption that rules were something they enforced, not something they followed. Now reality was correcting that misunderstanding. The pressure inside the neighborhood kept building. Homeowners started attending board meetings again. Questions became uncomfortable. Expenses were discussed. Decisions were challenged. One resident asked why the board had approved removing a tree without verifying ownership. Another asked whether HOA insurance would cover potential liability. Diane suddenly found herself answering the kinds of questions she usually asked everyone else. Then came the moment everything truly changed. About 2 weeks after the utility company began its work, a storm rolled through the area. Nothing severe, just heavy rain and strong wind. Unfortunately, some temporary electrical adjustments being made during the easement corrections caused several common area lights to remain offline longer than expected. For 2 nights, portions of the neighborhood entrance sat dark. Residents noticed immediately. Complaints poured in. The same board that once obsessed over my tree, supposedly blocking visibility, now had people demanding answers about lighting, safety, and oversight. The irony was almost too perfect. Around that time, I received another call. This one wasn't from Diane. It came from the HOA's attorney. The tone was professional from the beginning. Mr. Caldwell, we'd like to discuss a resolution regarding the tree. There it was. The first real acknowledgement that they had a problem. We scheduled a meeting for the following week. When I arrived, every board member was present. Diane sat near the center of a table. For the first time since I'd known her, she looked tired. Not angry, not arrogant, just tired. The attorney opened the discussion by explaining that recent reviews suggested the tree had indeed been located entirely on my property. I nearly laughed at the phrase recent reviews. It sounded much nicer than we never bothered checking. Then came the apology. It wasn't dramatic. Nobody cried. Nobody delivered an emotional speech. But it was real. The board admitted mistakes had been made. Procedures had not been followed. Assumptions had replaced verification. As I listened, I realized something interesting. They weren't apologizing because they suddenly respected me. They were apologizing because consequences had finally entered the room. and consequences speak a language power understands very well. The attorney eventually outlined a proposed settlement package, including replacement landscaping, compensation for the destroyed oak, and coverage for restoration costs. Diane finally spoke near the end. She looked directly at me and said, "We should have asked first." It was probably the most honest thing she'd said in years. I nodded. Yeah, you should have. Nobody argued after that. Nobody raised their voice. The fight that had started with chainsaws and arrogance was quietly moving toward its final chapter. But before any agreement was signed, I had one more decision to make, because replacing a tree was easy compared to deciding what kind of person I wanted to be after everything that had happened, and standing there looking at the people who had caused all of it. I realized the ending wasn't going to be as simple as winning or losing. A lot of people expected me to go for blood after that meeting. Honestly, if you'd asked me the day I found that stump in my yard, I probably would have. Back then, I was angry enough to spend years fighting if that's what it took. But anger has a strange way of changing when you carry it long enough. It gets heavier, less exciting, less useful. By the time the settlement offer landed in front of me, I wasn't interested in destroying anybody. I was interested in making sure this never happened again. So I took the paperwork home and spent a weekend thinking about it. Every time I looked out my front window, I saw that empty patch of sky where the oak used to be. I remember my father sitting beneath that tree during summer cookouts. I remember neighborhood kids building forts in the shade. I remembered watching storms roll through while those giant branches swayed overhead like they'd been there forever and always would be. The truth was simple. Nothing the HOA offered could bring that tree back. Not money, not apologies, not legal victories. Some things, once they're gone, stay gone. The following Monday, I signed the agreement. The HOA would pay compensation. They would fund a complete landscaping restoration. Most importantly, they would adopt new review procedures requiring property verification before any action involving homeowner land. The attorney looked relieved. The board looked relieved. Diane looked like someone who had finally realized that authority and accountability were supposed to travel together. A few weeks later, the replacement tree arrived. It wasn't a giant oak. It couldn't be. You can't replace 80 years in a single afternoon. It was a young oak, healthy and strong, standing maybe 15 feet tall. I remember watching the crew position it carefully into the ground while neighbors gathered nearby. Several people came over just to watch. Some brought coffee. Some brought lawn chairs. It felt less like a landscaping project and more like a community witnessing the final scene of a very strange movie. Carl stood beside me with his usual grin. "You know," he said, "most people get even by arguing on Facebook." I laughed. Maybe I should have tried that first. Would have been cheaper, definitely less entertaining. He wasn't wrong. By then, the story had taken on a life of its own. Some residents thought I had done exactly the right thing. Others felt I should have pushed harder. A few believed the HOA had made an honest mistake and deserved more sympathy. And maybe that's where things got interesting. Because the longer I thought about it, the less I saw villains and heroes. Well, I saw were people who got comfortable. The board got comfortable exercising power without being questioned. Homeowners got comfortable assuming someone else would push back when things went too far. Even I got comfortable believing common sense would protect me from something this ridiculous. We were all wrong in different ways. The biggest change happened over the following year. Attendance at HOA meetings increased. Homeowners paid attention again. People read documents before voting. Questions were asked. Records were reviewed. Decisions were challenged respectfully instead of accepted automatically. The board itself changed too. A couple members resigned. New ones were elected. Diane remained for another term, surprisingly enough. But she wasn't the same person. One afternoon months later, she stopped while I was working in the yard. We hadn't really spoken outside official meetings since the settlement. She looked at the young oak for a moment. "It's growing well," she said. "Yeah," I replied. "It is." There was an awkward silence. Then she sighed. For what it's worth, I really did think we were doing the right thing back then. I studied her face for a second. She wasn't making excuses. She actually believed it. That was the scary part. Most bad decisions don't start with bad intentions. They start with people convincing themselves they're entitled to make choices for someone else. That's the problem, I told her. Nobody stopped to ask whose choice it was. She nodded slowly. For once, she didn't have an argument. She just walked away. And honestly, that conversation stayed with me longer than any legal document or settlement check ever did. Because in the end, this story was never really about a tree. It wasn't about landscaping, easements, attorneys, or HOA politics. It was about boundaries. The invisible lines people cross when they become convinced that rules only apply in one direction. The oak tree taught me something I wish I'd learned years earlier. If you don't defend your rights when they're small, eventually you'll be forced to defend them when they're much bigger. As for the new oak, it's still there today. Every spring it grows a little taller. Every summer it throws a little more shade across the lawn. Sometimes kids from a neighborhood sit under it, even though it isn't nearly as impressive as the giant tree that came before. Maybe one day it will be. Maybe it won't. Either way, every time I look at it, I'm reminded that respect matters more than power, and accountability matters more than authority. The old tree became a stump because somebody thought they could act without consequences. The new tree exists because they learned they couldn't. And here's the part ones still think about years later. If I had immediately hired a lawyer and gone straight to court, would the lesson have been learned? Or would everyone have just blamed the legal system and moved on? I honestly don't know. What I do know is that the moment people realize the rules apply to them too, everything changes. Maybe that's justice. Maybe it's just reality catching up. I'll let you decide. So tell me what you think. Did I handle the situation the right way? Or should I have taken the HOA to court and pushed for even bigger consequences? Was the board guilty of abusing power, or was this simply a costly mistake that got out of control? And if someone destroyed something on your property without permission, would you have done what I did, or would you have fought back differently? Let me know in the comments, because stories like this always seem to divide people right down the middle. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share it with someone who has dealt with an HOA, a difficult neighbor, or anybody who thought the rules only applied to everyone else.